All right, so today we have Sarah Carlisle Stewart, who is a child caregiver gone coach. Yay. And she empowers caregivers of all kinds, both personally and professionally, to rediscover and root themselves amidst their burnout, ultimately, so they can get back to a meaningful impact on their families that feels good, that feels aligned with their self-worth, authenticity, and integrity. And because she is a fantastic, wonderful person, she is going to give us this great presentation today about navigating boundaries and burnout. Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello.
Hello. Very, very excited. I'm just gonna hop into it. I'm gonna
Go
share
for it.
Screen. Is it shared?
It is shared. We can
Cool.
see it.
Sometimes I can't tell.
I understand that.
Cool. I am also going to turn off my camera because I'm looking this way, and it's just gonna make me weird.
That's understandable.
Cool. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about burnout in our industry, what fuels it, and how we can use boundaries to overcome it. The most important thing for us to continue caregiving sustainably and healthily is to do it with boundaries that reflect our self-worth. By prioritizing self-care, clarifying boundaries and expectations, and mirroring the team perspective, we can shift our burnout paradigm and step back into fully aligned, meaningful impact. So a little bit about me. My name is Sarah Carlisle Stewart. I'm a child caregiver gone caregiver coach. And just like Sarah said, my heart is to empower caregivers of all kinds. And I really mean that personally and professionally, because a lot of parents don't seem to think that they are caregivers. So my heart is to really empower them to rediscover and root in themselves amidst their burnout with supportive boundaries. Ultimately, so they can get back to meaningful impact on their families that really feels good, that feels aligned with their self-worth, their authenticity, and their integrity. So some more fun facts about me. Following my psychology degree and then some time researching child development at UC Berkeley, I started my child care career as a behavioral therapist. And the first time I had ever heard the term burnout was at my initial onboarding as a behavioral therapist. But it was more like a warning of the inevitable. I was told from the very start of my career that they had been struggling to hire. So many were burnt out and leaving the industry. So many couldn't effectively or healthfully balance their home and work life. And so the pool that they were choosing from was getting smaller and smaller as more and more people were leaving that industry. More and more couldn't balance it, and they couldn't stop themselves from bringing their work home. So that first year in early intervention, 3 of my direct supervisors left the industry. And the turnover rate for my coworkers was so high that the original therapists I had shadowed with were no longer working there by the time I had officially started. So it was kind of this statement that burnout in the childcare industry and child minding was a given, so be prepared. Nannies burnout, teachers burnout, therapists burnout. So I really didn't feel like I was equipped with tools to face it, let alone overcome it. And it really didn't seem that overcoming it was something that even happened at all, other than quitting as my previous supervisors had done. From there, I was pushed into the deep end with no resources to identify, let alone overcome burnout, and zero concept of boundaries. I quickly felt limited by the systems I was pursuing. So I decided to do private, more one-on-one care through nannying, so I could be more intentional and more collaborative with families. But little did I know that I needed self-worth rooted boundaries so much more in this personal home setting than I did in behavioral therapy. So burnout is on the rise. We need caregivers to be living rooted authentically in their own self-worth with healthy, supported boundaries now more than ever before. That being said, though the need for our self-care, the need for our boundaries is immense at this particular time in history, burnout is not a new plague to us caregivers. Burnout is so prevalent in roles like ours that Dr. Burnout cost the healthcare system $4.6 billion a year in 2019, which is pre-pandemic. So if you take that same drastic number and take it into our homes, into the mindsets of our personal and professional caregivers, the cost of our caregiver burnout is immense. I was told from the start that burnout in the childcare industry was inevitable, so don't fall into that trap. But at the same time, there was such a tremendous lack of education and resources. So first, I'm going to explain to you what burnout is and what it looks like. So burnout is the physical, emotional, and/or mental exhaustion caused by over-the-top, excessive, or prolonged stress. And particularly when that stress is so great that it outpaces our capacity to process it, to work through it, to complete the stress cycles that are created. So that being said, burnout has external, physical, and internal, emotional, and mental components. As a culture, we pay far more attention to physical ailments, things on the outside, things we can see. When we think of burnout, we often think of it like a marathon and hitting a wall, running the whole race, doing everything right up until the moment that we break. And that's true in many cases. That's what clues us in that something has gone awry. The breaking point is what clues us in. But sometimes burnout, especially for us caregivers, is like running the marathon, skiing the wall, and managing to scale it, to keep going, to keep performing. On the outside, we appear whole, but we really do not feel that way on the inside. Burnout can pop up when you feel overwhelmed by the amount of things you have to do, like analysis paralysis, when you lose the emotional capacity to keep helping and supporting, when you develop compassion fatigue, resentment, cynicism. Burnout can really make you feel dread going to work, getting up in the morning, going towards the crib, towards the bedroom. It can make you feel physically sick, thinking about your duties, thinking about what's expected of you, thinking of the ways you're showing up for everyone but yourself. And because burnout is so gradual, all of these things build over time. The signs and the symptoms, the warning posts, they creep up on us very, very quickly. So I like to call this the 7 deadly steps to burnout, kind of like the 7 deadly sins, so that we can kind of recognize what the path looks like. Like I said before, the only mention of burnout was at my initial onboarding, and it was more like a warning of the inevitable. And I think a big part of that is we're not completely sure how we got there once we do. So I've termed this the 7 deadly steps to burnout, so we can start to identify what we're going through, start to give names to what's happening, and break down the taboo nature. So number 1 is the compulsion to prove your worth. This is where it all starts, where we root our self-worth, our self-esteem. And that's why it's so easy for us as caregivers to slip into burnout, because we dive right into number 1. We feel good, we get rewarded for helping others, for doing good things, for solving problems of others, gaining their approval. And like I said, and I'm always going to keep repeating, it's not a bad thing to help, but it is a slippery slope when it becomes our only route. When we want to be a good mom, the best mom, a good nanny, the best nanny, when it overtakes our actions as compulsory, check into number 2, neglecting your own needs. Are you neglecting your own needs, putting your needs last, if ever getting to them at all? I know many of us have had crumbs for lunch, overextending beyond your resources, knowing you need extra sleep and you really wanted to make it to something, but you say yes to extra hours and duties, even though it's negatively affecting your overall wellness. And that leads us into number 3, a displacement of conflicts. You may feel guilty asking for time off, asking for a break, asking for a few minutes alone. You may have received backlash for expressing them, may have taken conflict eternally and personally, and now you ignore them, repress them, or harbor resentments. Eventually, that leads us to a revision of our values, acting outside of our integrity. And that sounds really serious, but it's not as serious as like stealing from the job. But it can be more subtle things like acting shameful, having self-critical tendencies, perfectionistic tendencies. I recall waiting for my boss parents to get home and then conveniently looking busy cleaning when they walked in, or wanting to make sure I was on the floor playing in midst play when they walked in. And this further emphasized where I was rooting in step one, where I was finding my worth, but it was exacerbated by self-sabotaging or limiting habits that kept me down. So burnout can ultimately make you behave in ways that are kind of foreign to you, make you feel completely lost from yourself, removed from yourself, muddied in the day-to-day. Eventually, that leads us to a denial of our problems, possibly even unable to see them at all, and let alone communicate them. Withdrawal and depersonalization, because who could ever feel this way? You start to feel overly responsible for the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others, start to be unable to even recognize yourself, losing yourself in the process, isolating, pulling away from community and support, may have lost a sense of your individuality, now starting to doubt yourself and your capabilities, questioning why you're even doing this work, why you became a nanny, why you became a parent. And then that all leads us to the big shebang, inner emptiness, depression, burnout. The taboo nature, this attachment to our worth and fear, ultimately keep us from shining a light on this pandemic to our caregiving. I think because it's kept so under wraps, we're unaware of what it looks like or how it truly manifests for us. Because burnout for us caregivers is caused by the stress in our caregiving roles, the components to our role begin to be those triggers. And then those trigger our self-limiting beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about our success, our identities, our roles. Burnout for us as caregivers is often fueled by codependent dynamics, in dynamics that you find your worth in, like a nanny, like a mom, a helper, a carer. And I like to introduce these conversations in a pretty straightforward way by saying, my name is Sarah, and I was a codependent caregiver. Not because it's Alcoholic Anonymous or Al-Anon or DARE, but I do say it this way because it's like the only familiarity I had, and I think most people have, with the term codependency. Codependency has always had a bad rap because of stigma and misunderstanding. It's a really big, scary word. And I'm first to let you know that I didn't know anything about it outside of unhealthy relationships with drug and alcohol addiction. But I didn't realize that codependent dynamics had overstepped into my caregiving, into my work, and into my being. I didn't know that codependency merely describes that energy exchange, the dynamic with someone or something. It describes the relationship, the excessive need for approval, worth, or identity, the enmeshment and entanglement of thoughts and feelings. I certainly never realized that I could be codependent with things that were good, that were altruistic, or even ultimately my sense of livelihood. For me, I had grown codependent with caring in general, with helping, with being a caregiver. It was much less a diagnosis or a strict label like I had considered it to be previous, but more so a description of the dynamic I was carrying. For caregivers, we are far more susceptible to this codependent exchange slipping into our role. Because when we organize our life around other people's problems and responsibilities, it becomes a slippery slope because we're then directly reinforced for that helping. And that's why I explain that burnout for a helper or a caregiver is oftentimes fueled by this codependency dynamic. Codependency is well-meaning. It makes sense that we start attaching it to our feeling of self-worth, identity, and safety. It makes you feel valuable, necessary, and good. There's a reason it feels good to help others. These situations in and of themselves are not bad. Our brains are wired for that love, connection, acceptance to help us function in community, collaboration, to help others. According to Our Body Keeps the Score, most of our energy is devoted to connecting with others. So it's not to say that you shouldn't love your caregiving relationships, that you shouldn't see the value in them and have pride in them. But when I started to become less Sarah, losing myself in the process, then it actually started to do massive disservice to the efficacy of my caregiving and eventually led me to burnout. When we operate in the codependent dynamic, our triggers will highlight our self-limiting beliefs that we've held on to. I'm not a worthy nanny. I'm a bad nanny, that we're unworthy of communicating our needs, unworthy of our livelihood, that our sole purpose is in service of other. You start to think, how could I simultaneously love what I do, but feel empty, unfulfilled, and useless at the end of the day? How could I be largely empathetic, but feel drained and discouraged by the same people I care for? For nannies and caregivers, we oftentimes overextend, even though saying no and setting those boundaries would save us from the burnout. Because when we have to say no to others, it kind of feels like we're admitting failure and shedding a part of our identity. In this way, burnout creates an existential crisis for us in caregiving. You might feel like to be a good caregiver, you're not allowed to inconvenience anyone. So we as caregivers become trapped in our situations. Conflicts start to feel like slights to our worldviews, a threat to our sense of self. It can start to feel like we ourselves are being criticized. And then from there, we react from a place of fear. And fear is not rooted in fact, but in negative thoughts and storylines in our heads about what it means to be a caregiver, what a good one looks like, what a good one acts like. Then from there, we become prone to the heavy winds of guilt and shame that prevent you from asking for help, taking mental breathers, or engaging in important self-care, which are the exact antidotes for it because they feel like violations or betrayals of our role. If we're not intentional or careful with our caregiving, we quickly see that shadow side of empathy. I allowed myself to become attached to these vampiric, codependent dynamics that took from me more than they gave to me. Even though I had been warned, even though I understood that under this dynamic, burnout was inevitable, we don't know what to look for, and we certainly don't know how to slow that avalanche once it starts. I really wasn't taught how to operate any differently, wasn't taught to set any of my own personal boundaries or set up realistic expectations, or to communicate them in ways that would align with those values. As a caregiver, you have undoubtedly outpoured so much love on the families you serve, your nanny family, your personal family. But because of this dynamic, because of the paradigm that we're in, codependency promotes burnout, feeds and fuels burnout. While you're managing the day's stress, your body is while you are managing the day's stressors, your body is managing the day's stress. And it's absolutely essential to your well-being, the same way that sleeping and eating are essential, that you give your body the resources it needs to complete the stress response cycles that we activate during the day. We caregive, so the stress might be every day. And sometimes those stressors or triggers are inescapable because they're children or our families or something that we can't just not do. And then our stress cycles never get completed. Sometimes it's not about getting rid of the stress itself, but completing the cycle into every day. We have to rethink our goals for these caregiving roles. It's so important to recognize the energetic role we have in the home. As nannies and caregivers, we typically enter into energies already at play. Kiddo threw a tantrum 10 minutes before you came in. Mom had a hard time putting Bobby to sleep. Breakfast is running late, so everybody's hangry. Oftentimes we feel those dynamics in a room before we even know about them, before we know what to do with them. We are professionals at hitting the ground running, and we're professionals at anticipating the needs of others. But because of this, these instincts may cause you to tiptoe, to make yourself smaller, try not to trigger anyone. And this might cause you to people please or act foreign for approval, attempting to counterbalance the thoughts and feelings of others, trying to make them feel the most comfortable, no matter its cost to your own well-being. And many times we are hired out of necessity. Parents are returning to work, siblings are born, developmental delays appear, families expand and they need more helping hands. We know how to swoop in times of need and crisis. But consequently, we develop habits that are instinctual, but not always intentional. We have more and more opportunities to bring restoration to our families as the modern family is experiencing more and more shifts and looking more and more different than ever before. Parents are working strange shifts. Siblings are at home with distance learning. Parents are working from home in DIY office spaces. Families are relying on more helping hands than usual. And because of this, we have a unique opportunity to reshape these systems that have been preventing us from the true healing, the true growth and restoration for those families. Like the first stepping block to burnout, it starts with how we perceive our worth. It all starts with our mindset, and it is so vital that we recognize the privilege, the honor in our roles as caregivers, as nannies, as parents. Own the healing presence and the influence that you have. Our kiddos will remember most how we responded to this unprecedented time than the details of it itself. To some of our kiddos, this time and history is very fear-inducing and can be very confusing. This change to their lifestyle is so unprecedented, and they feel all of the energies floating around too. So instead of adapting to these energies as we have in the past, we have to start influencing these energies. Like I mentioned, we often hit the ground running, make habits that are instinctual but not always intentional, not always rooted in the values that we want to be rooted in. And there are so many ways that I was having self-sabotaging habits that were not rooted in my self-worth or what I really wanted them to be rooted in. That looked like, for me, walking on eggshells, holding back my personal thoughts and opinions, overextending beyond what I'm capable of, working full weeks, even months in a row without personal time for rest, bending over backwards to get everything done just perfect, neglecting my needs, driving home like with my eyes kept open with chopsticks to keep open. It's so important for us to ensure that our cups, our worth cups, are overflowing to be able to pour from them sustainably. We need to start putting on our hypothetical oxygen masks first. The best thing we can do for our families is to be on our own side. When I am really in a rut, when I'm in the midst of my burnout, self-care really is the farthest thing from my priority. When you're a helper, it's easier to brush off your own self-care because it feels like you're capable of doing more, caring more. If I'm spending less time rub-a-dub-dubbing in the tub, I might have more time to read books to little Timmy. But it's actually a huge disservice to the helper and the helped when we are operating at half full. It's so easy for us to keep going despite being hungry, tired, afraid. I'm the first to admit I'll go a full day forgetting to feed myself and living on caffeine. Whether I recognize it as such or not, these are ways I'm neglecting my self-care and my self-worth. When we use this old narrative and this old pattern, we often buy into self-limiting beliefs that we are unworthy of communicating our needs, unworthy of having lives to ourselves, that our sole purpose is in service of other. But that leads us to martyrdom and a total false sense of humility. Caring is not the problem, that we are helpers is not the problem, but the mindset that we're operating from. When I buy into the self-limiting belief that I can't get any self-care and then operate from that place, I fulfill that with self-sabotaging habits, like overextending beyond what I'm comfortable with, putting myself in compromising situations because I fear speaking up, neglecting and suppressing my own feelings, engaging in those codependent dynamics. It's important for your longevity and for the wellness of your family when everyone's authenticity is honored and celebrated. The second component to healing this burnout dynamic is clarifying and setting the boundaries and expectations so that they are aligned with the values and the worth that you incorporated in step one. It may seem like a silly reminder, but you do not need to give every minute, every thought, every feeling of your day to those you care for to be a good caregiver. You do not need to care too much to be a good caregiver. In fact, caring too much that we lose ourselves and our purpose is a tremendous disservice. As we've sprinted to aid our families, sprinted to harmonize, balance out the energies, the tough feelings, I've noticed many of us developing that compassion fatigue, that caring too much. When you're invested so wholeheartedly in caring, when it's your existence and your entire being, it's easy to fall into that burnout trap. This is something that I was all too familiar with before COVID, before the pandemic, before the unprecedented. But now our families are experiencing various levels and severities of trauma, individual and collective. We've got loss of jobs, loss of work, loss of guaranteed hours, school year changes, fundamentally changing how we go back to school, changing what summer vacation means, fear and paranoia of sickness, spending time on top of each other with less time to unwind. The thing is, at the end of the day, you probably never cared about being a good caregiver, but instead of giving the most impactful care to our families. So instead of giving everything into caring too much, recognize that boundaries will provide the landscape for true meaningful care so we can keep doing it and we can keep doing it well. Boundaries like codependency can sound really scary, especially when the context we know it in is in a generally negative light. Like my familiarity with codependency being only with drugs, alcohol, abuse, the glasses through which I looked at boundaries was also negative. So I kind of just threw it aside. There was no way it was relevant to me. And boundaries make us really uncomfortable in our current paradigm. We may start asking, can I actually be a good person? Can I actually be helpful and set boundaries? If they make me feel guilty, are they good? Are boundaries harsh, selfish, or mean? In our current system, the current dynamics that we're operating under, we're usually only setting hard boundaries, setting boundaries in situations that are confrontational or uncomfortable. Something happened that hurt, so you set the boundary. So we approach boundaries as hard walls that scream, stay out. But boundaries are not those walls. If you imagine yourself as a house, boundaries are not the walls or the infrastructure, but instead they tell people where the front door is, how to enter appropriately, how to enter respectably. It explains what the dynamic and what the rules of the relationship are, what the responsibilities of the relationship are. If people enter your house, crashing through glass windows, tearing down your curtains, trekking mud through your carpeted room, if people enter through the back door unannounced, demolishing it down so the door becomes unusable, if people drive right through the walls, taking it down, hurting the actual infrastructure of the house, this is why boundaries are so important. They tell people how to enter the house sustainably, healthily for everyone. So they don't get hurt along the way, misinterpreting my stone garden for a walking path. So they don't think the open window is an invitation for them to jump in that way. The importance of clarifying our boundaries up front and with honesty and going for the relationship is ultimately in your favor. Because boundaries teach the other party, the other half of the dynamic, where the responsibility of one party ends and the responsibility of the other party begins. Boundaries teach people how to approach you with the most sustainability for your dynamic, for the infrastructure of the house. If people come barging through the back door, breaking the glass windows, bulldozing the walls, then there's no room on the walls for your creativity, no room for you to sit and dwell. Boundaries in and of themselves are for relationship, are for collaboration, for building, for growth. Boundaries are the parameters of the relationship, and they do not have to be scary or confrontational. Instead, we can start to use clarifying expectations so that everybody's on the same page. When we set boundaries that are reflective of our self-worth and reflective of our self-care, they're directly in service of us to embrace a team and growth mindset for our families. When you clarify what's expected, everybody is able to show up with confidence. There's much less room for second guessing. There's much less icky feelings of being left confused from miscommunication. And this is especially true as we're navigating these unclear waters amidst the pandemic. We now may be on the receiving end of others' feelings, energies, thoughts more than we ever have been before because our external stressors have increased. And so for caregivers in particular, family tensions are rising and there's tons of energies bouncing around. And so it's so important for boundaries as they lay the foundation for that team mindset. You are a caregiver. You're naturally empathetic, intuitive, you're a helper, maybe even a people pleaser like we talked about, but you are not a punching bag. Oftentimes as caregivers, if we bought into the idea that we're less than or merely there as the help, or at my lowest, maybe I do get paid to be a punching bag, that narrative, that dynamic no longer serves us. It actually never did, and it prevented us from truly showing up for our families with impact. Instead, this is a chance to reset the expectations, shift the mindset, starting with us. When the critical companion in the back of our head tries to jump in to defend you when feelings are projected onto the mirror that you are, which is especially true in our time of quarantine, sheltering in place, pandemic, where more parents are working from home, more nannies working alongside parents. Parents are kind of like coworkers more than they ever have been before. I've seen many of us now experiencing and seeing mom guilt at extreme levels. And I tell nannies, because we are the mirror in the home, we are oftentimes going to be on the receiving end of feelings. It isn't always reflective of us, but it does affect the energy of the day to day, does affect the dynamic, and does affect the opportunities for true meaningful impact. So we can start to use these as opportunities to show up with full force as a healing presence and choose to influence that energy. This serves as an opportunity to actually turn up the volume in our caregiving, in our parenthood, in our nannyhood. It doesn't have to take long to start caregiving rooted in your self-worth, but it does require stepping up for yourself with powerful mindset shifts that dismantle the self-limiting beliefs and self-sabotaging habits that ultimately embrace the team mindset. I've received questions like, how do I approach my mom boss defensive that kiddo sleeps for me peacefully, but not for her? How do I share my knowledge and expertise without condemning her or making her feel like I'm not on her side? And I always applaud these conversations and these questions from the get because it really illuminates the intention of the team. Nannying, caregiving is lovely because it can be all intentional. It can be very, very, you can put a lot of care and effort into it. But at the same time, it can feel very overwhelming and unguided. And when we operate in the codependent dynamic, that all those feelings and the mom guilt can kind of look like this. If mom is working from home, but finds her value and her worth in being a mom, then nanny comes and sees kiddo so excited to see her. Mom gets a little hurt, starts to give nanny a to-do list because it makes her feel like a better mom, more involved, not passive, letting somebody else raise her children. But that, on the other side of it, makes nanny feel unseen, makes her feel condemned. Like, don't I do this every day? Haven't I been doing this every day for the past 3 years? When we operate in the codependent dynamic, our triggers will highlight our self-limiting beliefs that we've held on to. Like, I'm not a good mom, not a worthy nanny, I'm a bad nanny. All the lies we've bought into and absorbed about our worth based on how we show up. Through culture, movies, shows, we absorb all of these ideas about motherhood, parenthood, nannyhood. And then when we receive criticism or are on the receiving end of that mom guilt, it's that is really coming up. We've become accustomed to defining ourselves by our roles, by our beliefs, by our ideologies. And we start to take that on top of those limiting beliefs and start to engage in ways that preserve the idea that we are less than, that we are unworthy. And it can start to feel like our essence and our being is being criticized, and you jump without recognizing it, which is something we as caregivers do all the time. Instead, when we stop, identify where the feelings are, readjust, and pivot the mindset, we have a better opportunity to do this. The very personal nature of our job is a codependent playground, but it's much easier to see the codependent bait when we are captivated by our own purpose and rooted in our own self-worth. The guilt trips, the others' feelings, the projections of insecurities are also the very things that make this work so fruitful when we approach them as opportunities to grow. We are the mirror in the home of the families we serve. When we receive these, we have the opportunity to reflect back love, worth, and intentionality. Let's reset expectations, welcome projections, set boundaries, and emulate a loving, healing response. This is such a powerful way to embrace and embody the team mindset by not taking on the feelings and actions of others, but by walking with them through them. That way, when things do happen, when little Bobby doesn't sleep for mom, we're confident in our worth, we're strong in our values and boundaries, and we can bring out our methodology, our step-by-steps in non-confrontational, collaborative ways. We're able to recenter and return back to the intention of it all, a healthy kiddo, a happy, healthy family. In the end, I return to calling this an opening of a conversation. I think all too frequently, especially when we're operating from a place tied to the codependent dynamic, we're afraid to ask for help, to candidly and transparently talk about the things that we go through. When we receive our worth from caregiving, we may feel like a failure by admitting when we need help. But I call this a conversation to remind us what we were all called to emulate here, that it takes a village to raise our families, to raise ourselves, to live in community. And in order to make a shift in the burnout paradigm, we need to shift our focus to celebrating us caregivers in our fullest authenticity. And that, folks, is what I have for you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic with so many just things that I never, really thought about. The door, the boundaries being the door to yourself was so interesting and so good. It's so good. I'm going to really quick, Sarah, thank you so much again for just being you and giving us all this wonderful information and all these wonderful resources for being able to take care of ourselves in the best way and fill up our own cup. And is there anything that you would like to plug, and anything that you would like people to know going forward about where they can reach you, about where they can find you, anything like that?
Sure. My Instagram is basically the place I hang out the most. So my link in my bio at my Instagram, it's a link tree now. So you could probably actually look up Linktree and then The Modern Nanny, and you can see what I have to offer. I have a Burnout to Boundaries course that is self-paced. Some people don't really want to meet with somebody else. They just kind of want to hear it in a setting like this. So it's a self-paced course with videos, me chatting to you. I offer intensives, which are just an hour-long one-on-one for us to dive deep into whatever you need support on. We don't have coworkers, so sometimes we're like, I need a coworker to just like work this through with. That's an opportunity for that. And then I'm also working on a Slack community for people to access, to have community with other nannies. And
I love Slack. Slack is the best.
It's the best.
It's the best. Well, thank you so much.